Okay, well, good to have you back again and get started with another class here. Today, if you've looked at your syllabus, I'm sure you noticed we're going to talk about intellectual considerations. Now, what I mean by that? Well, let me take a pause here and talk about what this class really is and what this class isn't. I presume by now you've probably figured that out. Hopefully you figured it out before you signed up for the class and start taking it, but I do want to cover a few of those details right now. If you took this class thinking I was going to give you the 10-step plan that you could just take anywhere in the world and apply and you would become this wildly successful evangelist, winning everybody in the whole area to the Lord or something, that's not what this class is. And the reason that's not what this class is, no such method, no such plan exists. If it had existed ever, it would have been put in the Bible. The good Lord would have given it to us and said, here's exactly what you want to do. But God didn't do that. He gave us the Bible. He gave us what we were to present. He gave us some examples of how other people presented it. Some of them good, some of those examples where they failed. Certainly Paul getting stoned and nearly killed when he was trying to preach on his first missionary journey wasn't a very successful trip. But he learned from that, and we don't see that happening too much after that. He did get in some trouble and, thrown out of a few places, but not like he did on the first. On the first, we also see he wasn't too successful. I mean, he started this group with Barnabas, and it broke up. It split apart. And so he had to kind of start over again. So we have good examples, and we have examples where people tried, and they failed. And we're to learn from both of those. And from that example, we can say that we are probably going to try, and some of the things we do will probably be successful, and some of the things that we do will fail. And that's to be expected. And so in this class, I'm not going to give you, this is the method I want you to use. You go over where we're going to go, and you do this and this and this, and everything's going to be perfect. That isn't possible. And if somebody tries to sell you a method like that, you can be pretty sure they don't know what they're talking about. Probably offering you some swamp land in Florida too, or something like that. So if that doesn't exist, why do we teach a class on world evangelism? Well, there are tools that we can give. There are principles that we can live by. There are philosophies that undergird our evangelistic work. And all of those things are helpful. And so that's the reason why today we're going to talk about intellectual considerations. What can we do to sharpen our mind, to sharpen our intellectual outlook on life so that we can perceive opportunities, so that we can analyze potential methods and then try them, decide if they're working, decide if maybe they're not working, and then discard them and do something else? That's the type of thing I'm talking about. How can we do a good job on the mission field in whatever situation we find ourselves with the tools that the good Lord has given us? Certainly one of those tools is a very sharp mind. With that as our primary skill, how do we use it? And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, in intellectual considerations, I heard somebody say once, I can tell you when a preacher's brain died. Well, that sounded like a pretty startling statement. And of course, it got my curiosity up. So I says, what do you mean by that? And he says, I can tell you when a preacher's brain died. And I says, well, how do you do that? Well, what shows you when a preacher's brain died? He says, I just go into their library and I look around. And you can tell by looking at a book if it's really old or if it's pretty new or if maybe it's brand spanking new. And so I just kind of look around and browse his library, and I look to see the most recent book that he has in there. What's the last book that he bought? And what's the last book that he read? And I open up the cover and I look at the date. And if that book is 8, 10, 15 years ago, you can pretty well be assured that somewhere maybe 6 months or a year after that book was published, presuming that he bought it a little while after it was published, not immediately the first day it came out, the last book that he read, the most recent book in his library, gives you a pretty good indication when that preacher's brain died. In other words, he quit using it. And when you quit using something, pretty soon, it's not going to work anymore. And so if a person isn't exercising their brain, just like they would exercise a muscle, it starts to atrophy. It starts to shrivel up. It starts to die. If you tie one of your arms in a sling and keep it that way for 3 or 4 months, When you took it out, you wouldn't be able to pick up a tennis ball with it. You wouldn't be able to eat with it. You wouldn't be able to do anything with it. It'd be stiff. It'd be useless. It'd be worthless. And you'd have to work. You'd have to do therapy and everything before you could get that arm back to the point where it works. Now you say, oh, wait a minute. How do you know that? All right. I did it once. I broke my arm when I was a kid. Back in those days, they didn't have therapy and everything. Broke it right in the elbow and then up here too. And so they had to put it in a cast that went from my wrist all the way up to my shoulder. And I was that way for about 3 or 4 months. Well, one day they came, they're going to take it off. Okay, I'm all excited. I'm happy. Of course, I'm a kid. I want to get out and play. I want to get out and play baseball, that kind of stuff, and climb trees and whatever kids do. And they took it off. And I went to move it, and I couldn't. It was frozen in place, useless. Well, back then they didn't have therapy, so little by little I have to stretch it until it hurt this way and stretch it till it hurt that way, and little by little I got it to work again. Now you can see both arms work pretty decent. So anything you don't use gets stiff, gets hard, and it starts to die. And it's that way with your brain, just like it is with a muscle. And so what can you do then? Well, you have to do something to keep yourself intellectually active. Now, that's easier today than what used to be. When we first went to the mission field, there wasn't anything like the internet. Computers hadn't been invented yet, let alone the internet. And so the only thing you could do is read books. So we did what we could do. Back then, I think it was Encyclopedia Britannica would give an old set of encyclopedias that they'd taken out of a library after they'd been there 3 or 4 or 5 years. They'd given a missionary to take the field on condition they never brought them back to America. They didn't want to hurt their sales. And so we got one of these free sets of encyclopedias, and I took a few books. Haley Bible Handbook, a book on church history, a few things like that. So I took some books that were theological and, Christianity related as well. And off we went to the mission field. We got down there was nothing else. And I was an avid reader. We didn't have television. We were way out in the jungle, nothing. And so when I wasn't out preaching, I'd sit around and read. And I've done something very few people have ever done. I read the entire encyclopedia from the first page of A to the very last page of Z. And I read it through. Some of the stuff was pretty helpful and pretty good. Some of it was, helped me maybe if I played Trivia Pursuit or something like that, but that was it. But it kept me intellectually active. So you need to do something to be doing that. Now today we've got the internet, and wherever you are in the world, you'll probably have access to it. If not full time, you'll be able to gain access fairly easily. And with the internet, you have access to the world's most vast library that has ever existed. You can find books on anything. You can either buy them, you can get one of these Kindles or one of these e-reader type things and download dozens, hundreds, thousands of books if you want. A lot of them are free. And then, of course, if you want specific books, you may have to pay, but usually that's cheaper than a print book. Plus, then you can carry it with you when you go. So you need to be doing something to stimulate yourself intellectually. And so I would recommend reading. Read about what your profession is. If you're a missionary, read books on missions, on what they're doing in this country, what they're doing in that country, what worked over here, maybe how this really great movement got started. Things like that. Things that will be useful for you. If you're doing a specific type of mission work for a while, I was working in literacy, training people, teaching people how to read. And so I read books on how to teach somebody to read or write, and better equipping myself in how to do that. So you can be working to improve your skills in what you're actually doing. I think everybody should have a hobby or two, something that you do just because you enjoy doing it, and read about that. Nowadays, you can watch the YouTube videos. You're watching this on basically a YouTube video, and learn that way. A lot of things today, when I'm trying to figure out how to fix my car or whatever, and I have no idea, you can find a YouTube video on anything and watch it a couple times and then do it. I got a computer I've got to repair. Checked on doing it. Well, the Apple Store won't do it anymore. It's too old. And go to somebody else, going to cost a fortune and all that. So watched a couple videos and ordered the parts and haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it, or I'm at least going to try. And that keeps your brain working. It keeps you active. There's other things you should do as well. You read, watch videos, things of that nature. Read novels, historical novels, or whatever, poetry, whatever, floats your boat. But stimulate yourself intellectually on a continual and a constant basis. You ought to discuss and talk with other people as well. Now, you don't want to do it all on your own, lock yourself in a room, do nothing but reading. You'd probably become shallow in a lot of ways, at least socially that way. But read and then talk to people. Listen a lot. We Americans are notoriously poor listeners. But if you go to another field and you just sit down and say, hey, tell me what life is like, they will. What's it like to live out here in the jungle? What do you have to know how to do to survive? What was hard for you? What would you like to have that you don't have? What do you enjoy about life out here? That kind of thing. And just sit down and listen to them. Have them talk about their family, their kids, their wife, their husband, whatever. And listen to what they say. They'll start telling you, oh, I got a really good wife because of this or that, or oh, we got all sorts of problems because of this. And then they will start telling you what they value. Because what you like about a person or what you dislike about a person tells you what your value structures are. And if you start learning what a person's value structures are, you're going to be able to do a lot better job adapting the gospel to them. Now, when I say adapting the gospel, don't think I'm some liberal, crazy guy that believes that, Bible's all wishy-washy. You can say whatever you want to say. I'm speaking about taking the message of the gospel, the good news, and applying it in a meaningful way to them. Now, here in America, apologetics has been pretty big. How do we defend the gospel to a person that's maybe an atheist or an agnostic or something like that? That's not a problem in most of the world. In fact, they say communism failed in Latin America because it insisted on being atheistic. If it had not insisted on that, it probably would have succeeded, at least at one time. And so in many places of the world, people are just naturally religious, and they have never gotten to that point where they question or doubt or anything of that nature. So a lot of how we do Christianity in America has been adapted to American culture, the way we preach the gospel, what we talk about, that type of thing. And you have to learn to do that wherever you are. Even here in the States, if you're in a little church out in the Kentucky, backwoods Kentucky, or if you're in a big city like New York or Chicago or something like that, you're going to have to adapt the way you preach the gospel and the aspects of the gospel that you present to those people. Because people accept the gospel if the good news talks to them. If it's something that has nothing to do with them, they'll go, okay, interesting, and it'll go right on by. And so with that, then, you learn to adapt the gospel to do that. I think you ought to discuss with people things that you maybe disagree about as well. Listen to what they say. Honestly listen. And then respond to it. I'd use the word debate, but sometimes debate is pictured as having a big argument. And that's not what I mean. But discuss things where you have one position and they have another. Listen to them. I'm not saying, well, then you're going to wind up getting converted. I hope not, especially if we're talking about Christianity and they're an atheist or Buddhist or whatever. But if we have differences with them, try to understand them. Why do they believe what they believe? And if you understand why they believe what they believe, again, that'll give you a doorway into what you need to know so you can present the gospel to them in a meaningful and in a way that's attractive to them as well. When you're discussing things with other people, then look for ways to go beyond the current issue. Try to find what's behind all of this. Usually people debate things like doctrinal positions and things of that nature. Are we saved by faith? Or are we saved by repentance and confession and baptism and all that? Well, both. Why do some people emphasize faith even to the point of maybe denying the other? And then why do some people go almost to the extreme of becoming baptismal regenerationist or something like that? Well, what has happened is they are applying something that was meaningful to them, something that spoke to their heart, to the issues that they faced. And so as a result, they think that that will work or is important for everyone. And it is not. That's the issue. We have to find out where the itch is and provide the scratch. We have to find the hurt, and we have to provide that salve or that balsam that's going to cure that hurt. And that's how we can successfully preach the gospel to others. So you have to work in a very diligent way. As I spoke about spirituality being a program thing, every day you do a little something in this area and that area, and prayer and Bible reading in that way. You ought to do the same thing intellectually. This is going to be critical here in the States. You've probably all had this professor that's boring as all get out. I hope I'm not one. I try hard not to be one. Why does a professor become boring? Well, they weren't that way at one time. If they were, they'd have never made it as a professor. At one time they were good, but what happened? Well, they reached a point where I've taught this class 10 times before. I don't need to prepare for it. I'll just teach it from my notes last year, and they start getting into a rut. And it starts getting to be routine, and it starts getting to be boring. And so if you don't prepare for something, I don't care how many times you've done it in the past, pretty soon you're going to be boring them. And then you're going to be boring yourself as well. And then that's when you lose heart for the job. It's when you get to that burnout that we've already talked about when we talked about spiritual things. And so you have to do something to keep yourself intellectually sharp. You have to study, you have to prepare. Now, if you're working in an area where the educational level is low and you've got a pretty good education, at least at college level, I hope you're going to finish here at KCU and maybe go on for a graduate degree. So you're up here, maybe they're way down here. Well, it makes it easy to teach without preparation. Don't do that. Prepare. In fact, sometimes to make things simple is more work than to make them complicated. And so if you're trying to take this complicated thing of the gospel, grace for example, and present it to them in a clear and simple way that they can understand it, that takes work. It takes work to figure out how to do it, and then it takes work how to adapt it and apply it to them where they are and in the issues they're facing in life, and to offer to them something in the gospel that makes it attractive and appealing for them. Now, the final thing I want to suggest that you do here is when you've done all this other stuff, spend a lot of time doing research. Now, I realize that you're at a stage in your education where you're probably not doing too much research yet, but that's why we put you to doing book reports and these reports where you're going to get up and make a presentation and stuff like that. We're starting to get you started in that process. But if you're going to go to a mission field, buy a good book on research. I can give you one or two if you want. Drop me a note and I'll suggest it. A guy named James Spradley did Participant Observation. That's a very good one. There's some other ones out there as well. And get a simple book on research. Read it, and then when you're bored, do research. I sit around in airports a lot as I'm traveling back and forth from Columbia. I'm going to be on campus here before too long, I hope. I hope every one of you find a way to take one of my classes I offer them. I'd love to get to know you personally. I can't do that by this methodology very well. I wish I could, but we have our interactions, but it's not the same as sitting there and getting to know you personally and see your personality and how you interact and, putting a face with a name and all that. Love to do that. We can't do it this way. But when I'm in one of these airports bored, coming back, maybe getting ready to come to KCU and teach on campus, what do? You can be bored out of your mind sitting there for 2 or 3 hours waiting on your airplane, or you can do research. Now, what's research? You simply watch and observe, pay attention. What's everybody doing around here? And I have a habit. I usually carry a notebook now. I do it on a computer a lot or an iPad or something like that. I take notes, and I says, what's everybody doing? I start saying, well, then you start breaking it down to what we call taxonomies. What are the women doing? What are the men doing? What are the children doing? What are the little boys doing? What are the little girls doing? Where are the restrooms located? Why do they have them there and not over here? How does the traffic flow through these areas? How do they go about boarding the airplane, selecting the passengers, deciding who goes first, who doesn't? You can learn a lot just simply by observing. Why do people do what they do? How do they do something? And all of that starts to become part of this toolbox that you have that you can work with. Now, we can do it in a mundane area like the airport, but you can really do it effectively when you're trying to learn a new culture. So you start observing, as I've already mentioned. You start talking to them, as I've already mentioned. You start listening to them, as I've already mentioned. And somewhere along the line, you start taking notes about what you hear and what you see and what they do. And then pretty soon you're going to start seeing patterns of behavior. And those patterns of behavior are going to start opening the door for you to their culture, to their worldview, to that dark place in their heart that they do not even see, that tells you why they do what they do and what's the purpose of it, that which functions on the subconscious. If you learn that with them, you've learned a lot. Made it a little bit longer today, but it's a long one. See if we can get it uploaded. God bless. Talk to you next class.